In this History Illustrated video, we're going to take a look at the vocabulary word guerrilla warfare. Now, guerrilla warfare is a style of fighting or certain tactics, things that they do to help them win. Now, guerrilla warfare normally consists of a military that is composed of irregulars or civilians. It's not an actual real army, so I'm going to put civilians here as well. So these are the types of things you would see consisting of a guerrilla warfare army, similar to a militia. Now, some of the strategies they would do would be non-traditional or non-normal. So I'm going to put non-traditional, which means they're not normal. It's not a normal type of army that they're going to be using different tactics than a normal army. So, for example, here I'm going to show you some guys walking down a road. And let's say there's a guy hiding behind a tree, and he is thinking about attacking him. This would be an ambush. If he sneaks around and he attacks them from behind without them knowing, this is called an ambush. That is one major tactic. If you see here, tactics, that's a style that they would use to try to make sure that they can win the war. You see, guerrilla warfare normally consists of a small group of people versus a large group of people. So they use strategies that will help them win the war. So some other strategies might be sabotage. They might sneak in at night and destroy equipment that you need. Or raids. They would just show up and take everything that you got if they know that you're not there and paying attention to it. So these strategies help a small group of members help to beat a large, more organized army.
The Lauren or Lauren of Arabia is an adventurer from England. He was a military strategic expert. He also wrote the masterpiece The Seven Pillars of Wisdom in 1927. He created the Arab Revolution and started to fight against the Turk. He was helping the Emirate when dealing with Turkey during World War I. He introduced the theory of guerrilla tactic in an article he wrote in 1938. In his article, he compares the guerrilla fighter with gas. Militant fight in the operation area and randomly. They occupy a very short core while the core gas molecule occupy the smallest container. Militant can depend with group for tactical purpose but scattered leadership position. Fighters like that are very hard to beat.
Mao Zedong was the leader of the Chinese Communist Party. He became president of the People's Republic of China in 1949. At the time he was leader, the Chinese people lived under his iron hand. In the civil war in China against the nationalist camp, Mao led strategies often adopted by many as a guerrilla warfare strategy. His principle of war strategy was while opponents advance, we retreat. When the enemy's camps, we harass. When the enemy is tired, we attack. When the enemy retreats, we pursue it. One of the slogans was rapidly adopted as a symbol of Mao's strategy is pull your arm before hitting. In this way, the blows out will be more powerful.
General Nasution was known as an expert in guerrilla warfare. His experience as a guerrilla warfare expert comes after the Renville Agreement in January 17, 1948. At the same time, Siliwangi troops moved to Central Java. At the moment, Nasution was a deputy commander of armed forces. Indonesia Army expect that the Netherlands will repeat the first military aggression. Nasution was draft resistant for the people with the core of guerrilla warfare. Wars that happened in Indonesia is quite diverse. One of the most interesting examples of war was when between DI or TII against the military in the years 1945 until 1950. In South Kalimantan to East Kalimantan border was operated by Darul Islam group led by Ibnu Hajar. This group was one of group that is hard to beat, considering they use guerrilla warfare tactics, attack and run tactics. Attack the village, then run to the forest when the military force comes.
Vo Nguyen Giap, also known as the master of guerrilla war strategy. General Vu has successfully recorded himself in a history of Vietnam military because of his brilliant military strategies, like the siege of the French troops at Dien Bien Phu in 1954 and the Tet Offensive of the United States in South Vietnam in 1968. The flagship strategy is guerrilla warfare. In late April 1975, North Vietnamese forces has managed to make US forces and South Vietnamese troops to its knees. This event was marked by a sad symbol for America when the United States ambassador for South Vietnam flies by helicopter from the roof of the embassy building.
In the 30 years before 1975, two wars were fought on the sliver of Southeast Asian coastline known as Vietnam. The first war was a struggle between Vietnamese nationalists and the French colonial regime. That ended in 1954, with Vietnam split between the Communist North and the pro-Western South. In the second conflict, known as the Vietnam War, the United States replaced France as the chief Western power arrayed against the communist regime of the North, headed by Ho Chi Minh. Ho, supported by China and the Soviet Union, had successfully ousted the French and was prepared to fight a protracted guerrilla war against the South and its American allies. As part of a foreign policy that sought to contain communist advances, U.S. President John F. Kennedy increased the number of U.S. combat advisors to more than 16,000 by 1963. Kennedy's successor, Lyndon Johnson, capitalized on a North Vietnamese attack on a U.S. naval ship in the Gulf of Tonkin to escalate U.S. involvement in August 1964. Within a year, Johnson and his advisors were ordering heavy strategic bombing of military targets to check North Vietnamese advances. On the ground, U.S. troop levels increased dramatically, ostensibly to protect air bases. That role would widen as the war persisted. Viet Cong forces engaged in classic guerrilla warfare. They avoided conflict except in advantageous circumstances, melting into the jungle or the civilian population after an attack. Troops and supplies infiltrated through Laos and Cambodia along a network of jungle trails named for Ho Chi Minh. Low-intensity actions such as assassinations and terrorist activity made it impossible for conventional U.S. and South Vietnamese troops to attack the unseen enemy. By late 1967, the war had evolved into a stalemate. North Vietnam sought to take advantage with a series of bold attacks on southern cities that began on January 30th, 1968, and coincided with the Lunar New Year called Tet. Viet Cong troops attacked Hue, Saigon, and other population centers, winning a propaganda victory, if not a military one, by the time attacks ended 3 weeks later. The Tet Offensive and anti-war sentiment at home forced Johnson to turn over responsibility for ground combat to the South Vietnamese. This policy became known as Vietnamization. President Richard Nixon continued Johnson's policy and ordered a steady reduction in U.S. ground forces. To keep pressure on North Vietnam even while withdrawing troops and seeking peace, Nixon ordered bombing raids on Viet Cong supply routes and sanctuaries in neighboring Cambodia in 1970. As peace talks continued in fits and starts, both North Vietnam and the United States engaged in major military actions. In spring 1972, Hanoi launched a major land invasion of the South. In December, the United States began massive bombing raids against the North's principal cities of Hanoi and Haiphong. After the bombing ended, the two sides resumed negotiations. The Paris Accords, signed on January 31, 1973, led to a complete U.S. withdrawal and the return of its prisoners of war, but little else of benefit to America or its ally, South Vietnam. 2 years later, North Vietnamese troops swept into Saigon. In the course of the war, more than 2 million people were killed in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. More than 58,000 American soldiers lost their lives, and the landscape of Southeast Asia was devastated by over 3 times the total bombing of all of World War II.
There are four crucial elements that you have to know if you want to make a successful guerrilla war. First, it needs support from the peasantry, and the second, it needs support from a foreign power. And the third is, it must pair conventional tactics with guerrilla tactics at the right time. And the last one, it must fight an enemy that lacks counterinsurgency tactics.